Hello, my name is Sofía Rodríguez. I'm an assistant professor in the University of Cádiz in the south of Spain. It's a great pleasure for me the invitation to participate in this webinar about identities, ethnicities, and nationhood in the Oxford University. I'd like to give thanks to Dr. Angela Flynn and Elizabeth Bolorinos for this invitation. And the title of my contribution is New Protagonists of Recent History, an international and comparative history perspective on female identities in the struggle during the Spanish Civil War. Well, Spanish Civil War is an important crossroad of contemporary history where some of the biggest issues, such as mass politics, revolution, fascism, democracy, and reform, converge precisely at a most critical time, the late 30s. One of the key themes of the past century was the active participation of women in politics. This subject constitutes an enduring memory of the Spanish conflict, women taking a new revolutionary role as combatants and fighting for their ideas alongside men, sometimes as equals. I'd like to show my presentation. Okay. Although it's based on true events, this memory is still fraught with important omissions and imbalances that fail to accurately represent the political activities of women in the conflict, and more precisely their direct contribution to the war effort. The case of nationalist women is the best example of this, for they were supposed to be the antithesis of the only women who, it has been assumed, were really active in the war, Republican women. When thinking about women in the Spanish Civil War, the first images that come to mind are those of the milicianas in the right of the slide. Smiling young women in Madrid or Barcelona, dressed in workers' overalls, marching with other women and men to the front lines to defend the Republic from the rebel army and the fascist militias. Robert Capa, Agustí Centelles, Gerda Taro, the Mayo brothers, David Seymour-Chin were some of the photojournalists who captured still photos of the Spanish Civil War, eventually creating a collective imagery. A men's war in which astonishing snapshots emerged of women wearing holsters and pistols. These were free women doing something that they should not have done according to the predominant concepts of femininity, acting as equals to men, fighting and dying, but also making love guided only by their own will. When looking at the pictures of the young milicianas, it's almost impossible not to think about their tragic fate during the Francoist dictatorship since 1939 to 1975. The milicianas, or militia women, became a revolutionary icon during the war, later being involved as the spirit of evil during the post-war period. However, behind the images and their symbolism, there are real women, revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries. The negative images of the milicianas were expanded and publicized by nationalist propaganda, which presented both militia women and militia men on the Republican side as degenerate killers ridden with physical and moral illnesses. This discourse explained that the perversion of traditional social roles, the submission of the poor to the social betters, was parallel to the subversion of gender roles, the submission of women to men. This led to chaos, both in the streets at home, and to the Holocaust, a word used in religious terms to portray the Catholic suffering of Spain. Opposed to those images of Republican women were and still are those of nationalist women. Fascist propaganda made sure that such differences were evident. These ideas and images were the staple of the hundreds of books by pro-Franco authors, mostly published in the post-war period, many of the authors being members of the clergy and describing the horrors of what they call the Red Terror in Republican side. In this text, nationalist women were supposed to have supported both established social and gender traditions, having collaborated in the war effort without transgressing these roles. During the dictatorship, this was the official truth. After Franco's death in 1975, precisely to build a new democratic identity in Spain, historians looked for stories of resistance against oppression and for democratic roles. This explains why Republican women became a main object of study. But what was the women mobilization and political violence before the Spanish Civil War, the tradition of mobilization among Spanish women? Spanish women were participants in the political violence of the early 20th century. It's a fact, it's a real fact. The attempts to transform society, politics, and incipient liberal state came mainly from radical anarchist and Republican movements. The strikes on 1901, 1902, 1909, the Tragic Week in Barcelona, or 1918, were joined by not a few women who had to accept with the radical methods of direct action. Direct action is the name in the anarchist language for the political violence. The so-called Bolshevik triennium since 1917 to 1920 turned the female collective agency into a more organized and revolutionary movement channeled through the class unions and the Socialist Party. One of the first politicians to advocate this revolutionary path and abandon training to join the nascent Communist Party. Some women, like the female leader Virginia Gonzalez, from the male labor organization, saw a conscious decision to support political violence, positioning themselves against normative gender discourses that advocated inaction and the radical disconnection between women and arms. Meanwhile, the end and the post-war period after the World War I, the Great War, and the rise of fascism to power in Italy in 1923 coincided with the military dictatorship of Primo de Rivera in Spain. In the slide, you can view the Primo de Rivera's family. During this period, the general paternalism led to the rise of some elite women in local politics. And above all, the 20s coincided with the nationalization of the masses in Spain through the great social presence of Catholic Action for Women and Catholic unions, influences by the Pope Leon XIII with the encyclical Rerum Novarum. In 1931, the Second Republic is proclaimed in Spain. The mobilization of Spanish women took a quantitative leap with the birth of the Second Republic. In February 1934, an anti-fascist women committee was established in Madrid. Within a few short months, this committee will be extended to the main cities and provincial capitals. The Second Republic had led the recognition of the feminine right to vote and the main social and labor and civil conquest. And women were not willing to lose those rights due to opposition from reactionary groups, which also included women linked to the conservatism and Catholic Action. But the outbreak of women soldiers did not occur until the bloody revolutionary strike in Asturias, in the north of Spain, in October 1934. Although we don't know how many were directly involved in the fight and how many women, like milicianas. We do know that the hagiography about the heroines of the left spread rapidly with the appearance of the first militia women who were identified as such. in Asturias appear the first images of the milicianas, and both positive and negative, realistic or otherwise. These images will be perpetuated during the war and in the post-war period. An icon, a prototype email, was created based on Aida Lafuente, a 16-year-old, and is the image in the slide. Her lack of sexual attributes, husband and children, made her a pure revolutionary hero in the collective imagery. Now, we can ask about what were the historical models for these women. Two powerful international references of female armies, the Mexican of the Adelitas and the protagonists of Maria Botkareva in Russia. In 1910, both the Federal Army of the rebel guerrillas of Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa recruited mestizo peasant women, illiterates, indigenous women, and women from the suburbs who were paid a salary named soldier to serve, cure, or bury their men on the battlefield. The reason was the absence of auxiliary quartermaster services in Mexico. On foot behind the horses or crowded on the roofs of the trains, these women, called soldaderas, and their children transported domestic and religious households to play their traditional role as mother, wives, maids, and lovers in the trenches. The female soldiers coexisted with the Adelitas, the name of the most popular corrido. Corrido is a popular song in Mexico. Coming from higher social layers and owners of the armed cavalry, these older women decided to march to the front to fight as men and obtain an informal graduation. In the other side, in the revolutionary Russia in 1917, the profile of the young combatants was also low social extraction as illiteracy. Many young women were involved in the fighting, hiding their sex, as did the most famous Mexican women and not a few Spanish women in 1937. The causes that led both to the front lines, as they happened later in the Spanish Civil War, were the wishes of defend the country and its class interests, earn a living with a decent salary, and above all, accompany their men. If until 1917 they joined the ranks individually, the Order No. 1 of February 1917 allowed the Russian women to form exclusively female units, such as those led in Mexico by Pedro Herrera or La China, and the socialist and communist legions of girls who made up the Avanti Battalion in Madrid in November 1936. In the slides, there is a group of female combatants commanded by Pedro Herrera, the Battalion of Death of Maria Botkareva, and the Avanti Battalion in Madrid. So, what was happening in the meanwhile with traditionalist, Catholic, and counter-revolutionary women? Although we have more and more comparative studies of the European civil wars after 1918, the revolutionary attempts that emulated the Bolsheviks or the totalitarian regimes implanted in this dark continent, we rarely link the crisis of the 30s in Spain with the other side of the Atlantic. However, there are parallels between the trajectories of both nations, Mexico and Spain, and a clear female ascendancy, both for the anti-fascist militia women for their soldaderas or adelitas, and between Catholics, traditionalists, conservatives, and pro-fascist women in 1934 and 1936, when the Spanish Civil War starts, and those other women names, Cristeras. Cristeras is the name for the followers of Jesus Christ. The growth of violence that occurred in Spain as a result of the burning of churches and convents in May 1931, and the secularizing measures of the Republican government were too close to the end of the Cristiada or the Mexican Cristera War in 1929 to ignore the almost 240,000 victims, lay and religious, mobilized against the so-called Calles Law and the 1917 Constitution, the Mexican Constitution, which provided Catholic worship in public. Several authors have presented social Catholicism as a catalyst for the nationalization and inclusion of Spanish women in mass politics during the first third of the 20th century, showing the effects that the 1931 Constitution, the Spanish Constitution, has on the feelings of millions of men and women in Spain, in my country. Let's think then that if this situation caused a distancing with the Republic of Ireland, for example, because Ireland was contrary to sacrificing his Catholic culture for social reforms, Mexico will feel that its own history was being repeated in the mother country in Spain with renewed forces. Many Mexican women challenged state anti-clericalism during the 3 years of the Cristera War, 1926 to 1929, showing us that daily resistance is not only associated with transformative left-wing options. That historical situation requires a broader understanding and marginality, power relations, and the political role of Catholic women's organizations. Their participation in this confessional uprising against the government of the nation Plutarco Elias, the President Plutarco Elias, was ignored by historians until in the 80s, when several American researchers such as Barbara Miller, Jim Maya, or Eileen Finlay did their doctorates on this emerging political subject, the Cristeras, holding interviews with some of their protagonists and revealing the transformation of their traditional role in the church from 1920. They saw that they could assume leadership in a violent company and then return to their traditional roles, as also happened in the Spanish Francoist dictatorship. These pretty brigades, the women's brigades of Santa Juana de Arco, were created to supply ammunition, money, provisions, reports, shelter, care, and protection to the Cristeros fighters, Cristeros warriors, with some activities very similar to those of the conservative Falangist women, Carlist women named Daisies, called Daisies in the Spanish Civil War. They came to be 25,000 women who work in total secrecy with an oath of obedience. In Mexico, most were celibate to avoid orphans or to avoid blackmail if they were caught. Those women transported ammunition in vests or in cart covered with corn or cement to the combat zones, where they were transported to the Cristeros on mule backs. The audacity of those young women were legendary, and they came to be supplied directly in the military factories of the capital through the seduction of the collusion of Catholic workers and some authorities. The Union of Mexican Catholic Ladies was one of those organizations that used improved skills such as vocational education, union organizing, and various morality campaigns to respond to changes in society by the Mexican Revolution in 1910 to 1917. For their part, the girls of the Mexican Catholic Women's Youth used the media to spread reactionary ideologies that would combat the leftist projects of the state, the Mexican state. Through its magazine and pedagogical companions, the GCFM, managed to mobilize teachers, students, peasant women, workers, and domestic workers, although the ideological base of Catholic feminism did not manage to save the enormous inequalities of race and class that existed within this political movement. In any case, Mexican women had enormous relevance as providers of arms, ammunition, and means among different groups, as well as in the conservation of goods and the clandestine Catholic court, regardless of the consequences that said actions could have. A work that, once again, will be emulated by the traditionalist daisies in the Socorro Blanco Wave A and the Fifth Column during the Spanish Civil War. Their experience showed that it was possible to fight, die, and kill for Jesus Christ to the point that the Mexican martyrs became a model for Spanish religious. The political culture that permeated the Vatican and Spanish Catholicism at the time, based on the exemplary lives of the saints, led us to read the historical events of the moment from a perspective that placed the Soviet Union and Mexico on the same plane that the counter-revolutionary and the anti-clericalism of the Second Republic in Spain. Once the evident relationship between the Catholic and counter-revolutionary action-reaction of the women mobilized on both sides of the Atlantic has been documented, we once again insist that the participation of Spanish women in the main scenes of political violence during the Republic began in 1931, but stood out from October 1934. Together with the Spanish Committee of Women Against War and Fascism in July 1934, a tiny feminine section of the Falange was the fascist party in Spain, was created in Madrid as the only representation of the Fasci Femminile that emerged throughout Europe. Next to the young fascists were the Catholics and women of order. Although they were trying to keep away from high politics, even the monarchists and Republicans of Popular Action have reached a large experience of mobilization and anti-Republican propaganda in previous years. Guardians of the Catholic tradition and the family as basis of the national state, they allied themselves with the conservative trade unions and the secular apostolate in their own counter-reformist crusades of schools, the civil code, and the penal code. It was in this context, in 1934, when calls for conservative women exploded to mobilize in defense of their home. Similar to what the anti-fascists did with their political prisoners, the Falangists and traditionalist women assumed the clandestine function of providing food and tobacco for their own, reaching out to seek funding for their semi-clandestine organizations. Finally, the period between the repression after the October 94 strike, the new victory of a leftist government in February 1956, and the July coup of that year was very violent. This spring in 1936 was very violent in Spain. The most conservative women, and above all the Falangists, were the ones who, taking advantage of their lack of control and supposed political inaction, dedicated themselves to the acquisition of arms to prepare for the coup in the absence of the imprisoned leaders. And this is the moment to start the Spanish Civil War in July 18, 1936. Nationalist women were normally studied because of their participation in the regime's tightly controlled feminine organization, and in particular the Sección Femenina, the women's section, led by Pilar Primo de Rivera, the unmarried sister of the charismatic founder of the fascist Falange party. in the left of the slide. In April 1937, when all political parties were united under Franco's command, that women's section became the single official organization for women in Spain. During the Franco dictatorship, it never released more than 15% of all Spanish women, mostly in the cities. However, his fascist outlook, their blue shirts, imagery, and rituals was very similar to those in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, naturally attracted the attention of both observers and academics. There are two main additional reasons behind the neglect of the study of nationalist women during the Spanish Civil War, and they are linked. One reason is that, as we have said, ordinary conservative and reactionary women are not a subject that feminists and other historians are always comfortable discussing, among other things, because they stand for the values those scholars reject. This, of course, is a generalization, but is undeniable that fascist and conservative women seem more attractive to historians when they are active members of political organizations, and particularly when they play key roles in these groups, because, as Claudia Kohn discovered for Nazi Germany, their degree of implication and activities within the regime defies traditional assumptions about passivity. These activities can be recuperated as practicing and misguided and even repugnant but identifiable feminism. This is the case of the ranks of the women's section, who, while preaching to her members and to the Spanish female population at large about the virtues of submission of their husband and of the motherhood and domesticity, often remain unmarried and run their organizations without any male supervision. Leads us the second reason. Franco's discourse of the role of its female supporters during the war was repeated by propaganda during the nearly 40 years that the dictatorship lasted and became an official memory that outlasted the regime. The result of this is that when historians of the Civil War period have studied the role of nationalist women during the conflict, they often have reproduced in their analysis what the Franco regime said that women did and should be doing, rather than questioning that these women were in fact doing. According to the official Francoist propaganda, women helped in the war effort by carrying out traditional feminine roles, nursing, charity and social services, sewing clothes, writing loving chaste letters to the soldiers, keeping the home warm and orderly for the moment that the men, the warriors, should return victorious, and so on. The validity of these stereotypes, and even shared by anti-Franco Spaniards, who were all too ready to accept such, women as the opposite example, in their case, negative or Republican women. However, as often happened with the dictatorship's public memory of the past, this narrative was both a simplification and a Manichaean interpretation of actual events. Nationalist women were not always passive mothers, passive wives, or passive sisters and daughters. Curiously, glimpses of this far more complex reality can be found by reading the very same Franco's account that falsified, at least in part, the reality of the nearly 3 years of violence and killing of the Civil War. Franco's women in Republican Spain, as was true of Republican women in Franco's Spain, played an active role in helping men to hide and to survive, and they were murdered for this than reacting to events individually for other reasons. Most victims of repression died in the first months of the conflict, when killings were widespread, caused by high treason, espionage, defeatance. But as the war dragged on, as we shall see later in more detail, many Francoist women did much more. They often became part of more or less formal resistance networks against the Republic. In the graphic, men in yellow, women in pink, and the summaries, the cases of trials in blue. In these networks, women, often young, clear-jaded and well-organized rather than suffering individual Madonnas, played a crucial role in helping fugitives or men already in prison. But we shall see, they did much more than that. However, when their stories were narrated after the war, normally by men, what was emphasized was not that. Their political commitment led them to fight, but rather than their actions were a natural extension of their femininity, and often the product of their candor and innocence, or at most, the already mentioned sense of dignity. Beyond the official action in dining rooms, hospital, or laundries on the front, both fascist and anti-fascist women were involved in activities of a political nature, condemned contraries by the Spain that was their lot during the conflict. That is to say, there were women who emulated the collection of female protests collected since the French, the Mexican, the Russian Revolution. They carry out acts of authentic political violence and civil disobedience. Clandestinely, those women collaborated with the armies and leaders in the boycott and current legislation. While the first kind of actions could be framed in the international repertoires of social maternalism and the weapons of the weak, the second make up a strategy now by a genuinely Spanish term, Spanish War, which emerged in 1956, the Fifth Column. As Ana Bravo indicates, referring to the Italian resistance, it's necessary to rethink the binomials, the adjectives, like active-passive, arm-unarmed, worthy and worthy, brave and coward. We have inherited those qualities from traditions rooted in time and on which it rests an idea of a nation closely linked to military virtue. That is why female participation in the back room, in the backstage, was so important. The use of violence or the defense of honor was not reserved for them. They moved without feeling of guilt through spaces that were familiar to them due to their little social prominence, from markets and portals to bedroom secrets. The counter-revolutionaries did not limit themselves to treating the advance of their combatants and using white bread as propaganda. But in addition to the division of the women's section in the infirmaries and lounges of the Nationalist Front, they created vast networks of resistance in the great capitals, Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, and in the rural areas like Almeria or Jaén, which have been studied by historians like Javier Cervera, Carlos Píriz, Angela Flynn, or by me in any case. There are two ways in which their illegal policy of opposition to the Republic was developed in a government shown during two well-differentiated stages of the war. The first will consist on the articulation of that original Fifth Column, which arose spontaneously in the loyal cities to attend to those persecuted from the right. This consists in both the support for the right-wing reprisals and the boycott of the legitimate government through espionage, sabotage, and control of the security forces, communications, and various administrations. And the second will appear in the autumn of 1937, when the Francoist intelligence services were centralized as a result of the militarization of those fifth columns. Two essays to moment in the Spanish Civil War. The summary, the conclusion of this contribution about these female identities in the struggle during the Spanish Civil War. Nationalist women were not the complete opposites of Republican women. On the contrary, the former were not just the passive and most compassionate angels, blue angels, depicted by the regime's propaganda and by their enemies, who helped to maintain an ideal of domesticity during the troubled times of war, revolution, and reaction in Spain. Instead, many of these women often risked their freedom and sometimes their lives to create, run, or just help in networks of espionage and resistance against the Republican government behind loyalist lines. Smaller numbers of women work in intelligence, gathering, and processing both inside Francoist Spain and in southern France. These women were remarkably successful in their efforts. Networks run by nationalist women were less likely to be infiltrated and dismantled by the Republican counter-espionage than those run by men. It also seemed that in rural areas, women played an even greater role than men in the activities of the fifth column. In any case, women were far less likely to be executed because of their anti-Republican activities. In fact, like the slide saw, after the first chaotic and violent months of the war, very few of those women were condemned to death and shot. This was a product of masculine ideas about femininity, in which women were not considered as dangerous and certainly not as intelligent as men, and they supposedly could not create or run espionage networks. In addition, for a number of reasons, women were not repressed as harshly men were. Both Republicans and Francoists shared those ideals. The sentences of death, yellow men and women in pink. Historians have underestimated nationalist women's participation in anti-Republican underground activities, in part because they have tended to make a false distinction between a supposed real fifth column, where men were clearly predominant, and against supposed merely supportive roles, where women were crucial and often in the minority. This is an artificial classification that does not accurately depict a reality that was more complex than that, because among other things, women were often conducting risky intelligence operations while at the same time supporting men. Furthermore, in the traditional analysis, the only women who are seen to have had a significant role are those of the Phalanges women's section. Many of whom continue to have a political activity, these Phalanges, within the organization and the regime's social services long after the war, during the Francoist dictatorship. However, these Phalanges were only a minority of the women who fought for Franco's side. The majority's action and their significance were semi-forgotten during the dictatorship and have remained so afterwards. This was in part because these now ordinary women fought to live the quiet, domestic, traditional Catholic lives that the regime's ideology prescribed they should live. This might look dreadful to our modern eyes, but as these women saw the reality, they have won the war. It's now the time of historians and researchers to continue research towards discerning if nationalist women were more active and useful to their cause than pro-Republican women behind their respective enemies' lines. And this is all for my part. It's a great honor for me to participate in this webinar. Thank you so much and see you soon.